Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're examining the state of Russian politics and its future through a new book about the country's most prominent opposition activist, Alexei Navalny. Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. So yes, we're back after a busy summer of research, and we'll be serving up a rich feast of research projects and findings on this podcast over the coming weeks. In this, our first episode of the new academic year, we're looking at politics in Russia. Alexei Navalny, who hit the headlines around the world last year by surviving an attempt to assassinate him by lacing his underpants with Novichok, and who now languishes in prison 100 kilometers east of Moscow, is Russia's best-known opposition leader. Indeed, a new book about Navalny's life and activism describes him as the main political counterforce in the country and its second most important politician. So who is Alexei Navalny? What does his current predicament say about the state of Russian politics? And what chances, though, that he or anyone else might be able to lead Russia towards a more democratic future? Well, one of the new book's authors is Dr. Ben Noble, Associate Professor in Russian Politics at UCL's School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and I'm delighted to say that he joins us now. Also joining us is Dr. Katerina Tertichnaya, lecturer in comparative politics in the UCL Department of Political Science and expert on Russian politics, who's now leading a major research project on non-violent repression in electoral autocracies. Ben and Katerina, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. And before we get into Navalny himself, let's look at the broader state of Russian politics. In the book, Ben, you talk about Russia as being neither a liberal democracy nor a totalitarian state, but as lying somewhere in the rather large grey zone between those systems. So just how would you characterize the nature of Russia's political system today?
Well, according to the 1993 constitution in Russia, the country is a, quote, democratic federal law-governed state, unquote. But in practice, formal democratic institutions like legislatures and elections have been largely hollowed out. Relations between Moscow and the regions are increasingly centralized, and the principle of equality before the law is frequently undermined. If we focus on elections, because elections have recently taken place in Russia, and we could see that multiple parties take part in elections. On the surface, that's what's often pointed to by officials in Russia saying, look, we are a multi-party democracy. But if we look at the steps taken in the run-up to elections, as well as what happens on election day or election days, we can see that electoral competition is subject to multiple forms of manipulation. So we can really say that they're very, very far from being free and fair.
Katerina, that relates to the notion of electoral autocracy that you have in the title of your own research project. What is an electoral autocracy, first of all, and how does Russia relate to that concept of electoral autocracy?
Yes, thank you, Alan, for the question. And also thank you for the opportunity to discuss this wonderful book. So electoral autocracies or hybrid regimes are a very special type of political system. They combine authoritarian practices, as Ben just said, with democratic elections, democratic multi-party elections. There are four specific features that set electoral autocracies apart from closed dictatorships or more closed authoritarian regimes. And these are precisely as you have just heard. Elections, the legislature, the opportunity for the opposition parties to compete and contest, the judiciary, and some independent media that provide opportunities for the opposition to contest the election. Electoral autocracies are many and varied. According to the Varieties of Democracy Project, for example, 1 in 2 citizens live in non-democratic regimes, and the dominant form of these non-democratic regimes are indeed electoral autocracies.
Why the electoral bit? Why not just have an autocracy? I mean, if a ruler wants to rule and wants to be in charge, what's the point of having elections and the appearance of democracy as well?
So there are a lot of benefits that non-democratic incumbents enjoy by holding elections. The first is legitimacy, right? They can claim to ruling via democratic means. Elections also reveal information about how popular the incumbent is, how much they are liked. They also allow the targeting of welfare to regions where the incumbent is doing poorly or better than expected. They also allow governments, the executive, to discipline poorly performing bureaucrats. So there is a number of functions that elections fulfill in these non-democratic regimes.
And if I can add something, Alan, to that point, Kat has very eloquently pointed out the different functions that elections can perform in non-democracies. And I think it's one of those questions that I often get. Why bother studying elections in Russia when we know that Putin is going to win, when we know that United Russia is going to win? Well, it's important for the reasons that Katja has pointed to. We can learn more about the nature of the regime by looking at elections. So even if they don't function like elections in liberal consolidated democracies, they're still really important to look at in order to learn more about the politics of particular countries.
And is electoral autocracy something that has kind of crept up in Russia over the years, or is it something that arrived with a bang at some point? I mean, just what are the dynamics of electoral autocracy in Russia? Ben, do you want to go first?
After the collapse of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s, I've already mentioned the 1993 constitution that refers to the country as being a democracy. And we saw the springing up of new political parties. And then in the 1990s, we saw quite extensive political competition. The problem was, though, that democracy ended up being associated in the minds of lots of Russians with chaos and disorder, and elections being overtaken by important, powerful economic interests, some of whom are referred to as oligarchs. And so we can see that in the 1990s, democracy flourished in a sense, but maybe over time, the extent of electoral competition decreased, including because when Vladimir Putin became president, he wanted to reduce the power of oligarchs, and so increasingly centralized political control, not only reining in the power of regions, but also preventing autonomous, independent political activity at the very top of the federal structure. So I would say that it didn't emerge one day that we can say that this is the beginning of electoral autocracy in Russia, but that we can look at the slow steps that certainly accelerated when Vladimir Putin became president, and we can certainly point to an acceleration of the authoritarian nature of the regime this year.
Katerina, would you add to that?
Yes, so I think it's very interesting how the term electoral autocracies comes about in political science scholarship as well. And I think this is, the emergence of the term coincides with, if you like, the end of the transition paradigm, which also coincides with the fall of the Soviet Union. So, for many years, we thought that when autocracies break down, when non-democratic regimes come to their knees, there will be a short period of time and then remote democracies will arise. And this was more like teleological, right? There was no area for doubt. Now,
so this is kind of Francis Fukuyama end of history kind of thinking from the early 1990s.
In some ways, yes, absolutely. And so what we realized in the mid-1990s, and this is when research on electoral autocracies really begins to flourish in the early 2000s, is that these regimes are stuck somewhere in this gray zone. Right, that's also mentioned in Ben's book. So they're neither democratic nor authoritarian. And there we have this this agenda of people describing democracies with adjectives, regimes that are neither democratic nor authoritarian, that they're hybrid. Some people even mentioned of vegetarian authoritarianism, and there's, we're trying to define this new phenomenon that we're seeing. But back to Russian politics, as Ben mentioned, I think there are some moments that defined Russia's turn into a more authoritarian regime. I would say the reforms of 2004, so these are the early years of Putin being in power, this push towards recentralization, with the elections for governors being abolished. I think that's one step. And of course, later on, 2011, 2012, after the large protests we have following the Duma election of 2011, and the legislation that begins to be enacted in early 2012, those are watershed moments in Russia's turn towards a more authoritarian state. And I know we'll discuss more about this, but I think 2021, the current year, also marks a very steep change in how Russian politics gets played out.
And just to make the very obvious point, to build on what Katya has said, very often when we talk about the nature of Russian politics, we're talking about at the federal level, so what's happening in Moscow. But we should also point out that Moscow is very varied when it comes to politics across its different regions, across its federal subjects. And so we can definitely contrast, for example, what happens in St. Petersburg versus what happens in Chechnya. In the former, there is more a sense of competition, whereas in Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the republic, really rules it as an iron fist. So I imagine we're going to be focusing mostly on what happens in Moscow, but we shouldn't forget the variety at the subnational level.
And let's focus particularly now on Alexei Navalny himself. So, as I said, you describe him, Ben, as the main political counterforce in the country, counterforce to Putin himself. So, who is he and what does he do?
Alexei Navalny, he's 45 years old. He's an anti-corruption activist. He's certainly the most vocal critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin, even when he's behind bars, which he is now. And you mentioned that in the intro, but I should also say that it's likely that he's going to remain behind bars for many years because new criminal charges have been initiated against him. And it seems like with a view to keeping him away from the public eye. He is able to communicate a bit with the outside world through his lawyers. So we occasionally see some messages from him on social media. He placed an op-ed in The Guardian. There was an interview with him in the New York Times where he talks about his time in prison. So his voice has definitely been diminished. But even with all of that said, he's still, I think, the most important political figure when we're thinking about Russian politics more broadly beyond Vladimir Putin. And we should be very careful when it comes to thinking about importance, playing the numbers game. The Kremlin is really keen to say, why on earth would you write a book on Alexei Navalny? Why pay attention to this figure who, according to the Levada Center, an independent polling agency, when they asked Russians in June whether they approved of his activities, only 14% of people said that they approved of his activities. Now, we should place those figures in context, and I'm sure that Cassia will be able to do that in a bit. We should remind people that in the media environment, Alexei Navalny is portrayed as an agent of the West, as a CIA stooge, as somebody who doesn't have Russia's best interests at heart. And so I would say that whereas the Kremlin would point to 14% and say, look, these approval ratings are abysmal, the fact that Alexei Navalny is able still to get 14% approval ratings, I would say, is quite extraordinary.
And what makes him the major opposition force? So you referred to him there as an anti-corruption activist. You also talk about him in the book as a politician and as a protester. Just where does he get his power and influence from?
Yeah, in the book, we try and answer the question of who is Alexei Navalny by focusing on three dimensions of his activities. He starts off in the early to mid-2000s as an anti-corruption blogger. So he is an emerging member of the Russian post-Soviet middle class. He starts investing stocks and shares, and he turns up to shareholder meetings and asks awkward questions. He clearly is a man who is very brave and he's quite eloquent, he's charismatic. And so he's able in those meetings to command a crowd and say, look, I want answers to the questions that you're not willing to give. And he builds a following by blogging about these particular episodes. And that's how most people in Russia got to know about who Alexei Navalny is. Because he realizes the ability to command a crowd, he then shifts to a more political role. He turns anti-corruption activism into a platform to say, well, hang on, look, I have broader ideas about how this country should be run. And he also used protests as opportunities to raise his own personal profile, but also to get supporters along with him on his particular mission. And I should say, anti-corruption, it's not by accident that he uses anti-corruption. It's an issue that clearly can unite people with very different ideological viewpoints. So you can unite the left wing and the right wing. And I think that's why it was so successful. And then the broader question, I've mentioned that he's charismatic. When writing the book, we had to be careful not to use the word too frequently, because there's a reason why Navalny has been able to punch through to be this leading figure. One of it is his charisma, his way with words, but also the fact that he's used social media to extraordinary effect to make what can be quite dull subject matter, corruption investigations, and to spread them to a larger crowd with memes and pithy phrases.
Katerina, you've read the book. What do you make of the account of Alexei Navalny that the book offers us?
No, I think the book offers a very, very well-rounded account of Navalny. And I also appreciate the fact that, the book is not just about Navalny himself. It's also about his closer allies, and not just about them even. It's about the accounts of ordinary citizens, the people who have joined the campaign, how they experienced the creation of Navalny's subnational offices that spread across the country around 2017, a year of presidential campaigning ahead of the presidential election 2018. I have to say, as a reader, those were my favorite quotes. It's sometimes very difficult to hear not what the elites think, but what ordinary people feel and how they experience the campaign. And there are several, I have to say, there are several highlights from the book that I have used and will be quoting for lectures and books and articles for many years to come.
Yes, I find that fascinating as well. Ben, sorry, on you go.
No, I was just going to say that, yes, this book is sometimes framed by booksellers as a biography. And that makes sense. If you're trying to find the book in a bookshop, yeah, sure, put it in the biography section. But it's not really a traditional biography. It's a political portrait of Alexei Navalny now, placed within the context of the team that he built over the last 15, 20 years, but also within the broader movement that he built, as Katya has mentioned. And yes, in chapter 4, The Protester, we draw on Matti Dollbaum's research, speaking to activists on the ground in these regional offices to give a sense of who they are, why they support Navalny, but also where they disagree. And that's, I think, one of the original contributions in the book. Some of the reviews have criticized us for not speaking to Navalny and his team. Well, we started writing the book after Navalny was in prison, so that would be a bit tricky. But we wanted this to be a book that based its original contribution not in terms of access to Team Navalny, but partly insofar as it could give this voice, this opportunity to speak about what activists think in the region. So I'm really pleased to hear that Katya liked that chapter, and I'm sure Jan will be very pleased to hear it as well. But, that also gives a sense of how we were able to write the book so quickly. We wrote the first draft in 2 months because we didn't have to go out and conduct original research. We're 3 academics. We wrote it on the basis of our existing knowledge of Russian politics, Jan and Morvan's existing research into Alexei Navalny, as well as these interviews that Jan had conducted between 2017 and this year.
You've said the book isn't a traditional biography, which I certainly agree with, having read it. It's much more than that in a sense. You really learn about Russian politics today as a whole through this book. But I'm still interested in what is perhaps the kind of ultimate biographical question. What motivates Alexei Navalny? So this extraordinary act of going back to Russia at the start of this year, knowing that he would be put into prison, knowing that he would be subject to all sorts of dangers to his life and health. Why does he do it?
We often get the question, was it a miscalculation? Did he make a mistake? And to us, the answer was always really simple. By returning to Russia, he was just completing a journey that he started in Tomsk on the 20th of August 2020, when he took off expecting to arrive in Moscow, but the plane made an emergency landing in Omsk. So that's, maybe the narrative explanation of why he returned. But the more substantive response is that he is a Russian politician. He considers himself a Russian politician who can only be effective in Russia. He has made it clear that for those politicians who remain outside of Russia, they're quickly marginalized in the minds of Russians, but also the Kremlin can play on them being outside of the country to reinforce a narrative that they don't have the interests of the country at heart. And then
what effect does he want, Ben? What you say he can only be effective in Russia. What is that effect that he's aiming for? Why is he trying to achieve that? Why is this so important?
So part of it is demonstrating his bravery and support to those supporters who remained in the country, that he wanted to say, if you're willing to support me, I'm willing to support you by returning to the country in very difficult circumstances. Now, I should say that it's likely that he knew that he would be jailed for a number of years. Maybe what was less likely was the extent to which his movement has been crushed. And so it's another question, I think, with that knowledge, would he have returned? Would his teammates have returned? That we don't know. In this book, it's not as if we can get inside his head, but what we try and do is make sense of what he did. And if you look at what he's done over the last 20 years, him returning to Russia, hopefully one of the things that the book does is make clear that isn't surprising. It fits in with the other dogged, brave acts that he has made in the past. So that's certainly one of the reasons why we wrote the book, to make sense of why he returned. But if you're asking about motivations, this is definitely one of the most frequent questions when he emerged on the scene. When he was blogging about these corruption investigations, people would say, this is a very risky business. People who look into high-level corruption can sometimes meet very difficult ends. They can run into trouble, putting it very mildly. So some people thought, okay, well then he must have high-level backers who are using him as a pawn to fight their own battles. In the book, we discuss some of that, but we don't come to any concrete answers, and that will have to be looked into by other people for future books, which we know are in the pipeline, and we look forward to reading them as well. So the motivation question is really important, especially when broadly in Russian politics, that is always part of the conversation. You always feel that there is another layer of activity. You need to peel the curtain back to see relations between members of the elite, even within the Kremlin. So often we can speak about the Kremlin as this monolithic actor, but there are definitely factions within it with different interests. And the suspicion back in the mid-2000s was that Navalny was backed by one of those factions against other factions.
Your answer there is very interesting, because at no point do you seem to contemplate the idea that perhaps he has a vision for Russia.
He does have a vision for Russia, and he's definitely, he has been criticized by the Kremlin as being a one-trick pony. As saying he can only speak about anti-corruption, and he likes standing in front of a crowd because people cheer and clap him. When he tried to run in the 2018 presidential election, he put forward a platform that forced him to present a manifesto that spoke about different policy areas. And on the basis of that, we can say, look, he is a liberal. He believes in democracy. He wants a rule of law state. He believes in the market. But also, he's a politician who is adaptable and wants to put together as broad a support network as possible, which is why in that election run he addressed more left-wing issues and was pushing for raising the minimum wage, was tackling inequality as one of the things that related, yes, to his anti-corruption message, but also could expand to a broader political program. Now, also one of the reasons why we wrote the book is to make sense of Navalny's shifting positions over time. We look at what he said over the last 20 years, and what he has said has changed, including the statements that he's made that some people claim are racist or xenophobic or nationalist. That was certainly a very visible part of his public profile in the mid to late 2000s, but now it's much less so. It's a separate question to what he actually believes in his heart of hearts. We don't try and play that game in the book because where does it lead? What we can do is focus on the extent to which he stresses certain things in his public statements, and he just doesn't really talk about nationalism anymore.
Katerina, would you like to add to that at all?
This is all very interesting, and I agree with what Ben said. I think on the question of Navalny returning to Russia, I think, as the book illustrates and as Ben says, I don't think that there was ever a question of him not returning or not making the trip back for a number of reasons that we heard about. And I think, the movement around Navalny, and this speaks to our earlier conversation, is of course a movement attached to the leader, but also has, the people, the campaigners, the professionals, if you like, who would be able to pursue and continue to pursue the work in Navalny's absence. And I think if you look at Russian politics in January, February, and earlier, like in the early spring months, Navalny's return does trigger this wave of mobilization in support of his return, condemning his imprisonment, right? And I think we know from Russian sociologists who interviewed participants that those protests were qualitatively different in that you had people taking to the streets for the first time, people who did not necessarily agree with Navalny or his, core supporters, but people who felt, frustrated and upset with the way Kremlin had handled things. Right. So we see this happening early on. I think it is the state's crackdown and the way it moved after spring that changes the course of events. Of course, in political science, it's hard to make counterfactuals. How much of the crackdown we saw later, when the repression against independent media, against non-governmental organizations was down to, these protests, or, how much was the Kremlin concerned about events that had happened earlier in the previous year in Belarus? How much was it the upcoming election we had, a few weeks back? So we'll never know. But I think it's important to contextualize Navalny's return.
And Katerina, that takes us on to the really fundamental question of, can Navalny succeed? Can he achieve his goals there? And Ben gave us some evidence a little bit earlier about the state of public opinion in Russia and just how few people appear to be supportive of Navalny's actions. Katerina, what's your take on that? Can he achieve anything?
I think I'll start off by discussing the public opinion aspect that Ben emphasized earlier. And, presumably one of his aims is to generate awareness and support for the movement, right? Not just for himself. And Ben was absolutely right in that in the last few months, we've seen that the share of public opinion supportive of Navalny has shrinked, right? So in September 2012, so about a year ago, 1 in 5, 20% of Russians said that they approve of Navalny, right? And that dropped within the year to June. I think July was the last survey we had. June, it was just 14% of the electorate. At the same time, the share of Russians who said they disapprove, so actively had an opinion of Navalny and said, I disapprove of him and his activities, increased by 12%. So it was 50% in September. It shifted to 62% in June, right? This is not surprising. This is consistent with what we have seen in the in state media. The narrative has become increasingly hostile. I think the coverage of opposition-led protest has also become extremely hostile, and it moved from this prior policy of tolerating or just not providing a platform or not covering protest or the activities of the movement to demonizing their activities and being extremely hostile. So I think when it comes to public opinion, support has not shifted. If anything, it has become more hostile. But I think where we do see the movement working is, and I cannot speak of long-term success, but I think, there's small things we can already observe. And the smart voting campaign in the recent election was one of those things that we could say, it has forced a response by the Kremlin. So for our audience, the smart voting campaign was the Navalny platform saying, okay, we will provide voters with a list of candidates they can vote for in every district, so that the United Russia candidate, the candidates from the dominant party, will not gain a seat in the State Duma. And we did see some of those candidates, I think it was 15 of them, Ben can correct this figure, gaining a seat in the election, so candidates backed by the smart voting campaign. But most importantly, we saw the Kremlin responding, and reaching out to tech companies in order to bring the list down, to make sure that YouTube, for example, will also pull the video that the campaign issued. So it is forcing responses. And I think that is, I don't know if it's an indicator of effectiveness, but it is an indicator of influence.
I mean, it seems really paradoxical, though, because it seems like campaigning for democracy actually leads to greater repression and actually leads to the opposite of the desired outcome, in a way.
Yeah, that's really tricky. And certainly some people are willing to say that one of the reasons why we're in such a difficult situation now in Russian politics, that things have got so bad, so repressive, we see so much coercion, is precisely because Navalny has poked, I don't want to say the bear, because that would be silly, but has prodded elites to push things further than they needed to be. Now, in the book, we try and steer clear of any judgment of Navalny. What we try and do is let the reader make their own judgments as to whether they think he has done the right thing in returning and whether his team have made the right choices ever since. But maybe a more positive way of spinning it is a post that we wrote for the Washington Post Monkey Cage, where we say that part of the strategy of returning was so that Navalny forced the Kremlin to show its true nature, to show the extent to which it was willing to go to deal with a politician who just wants to take part in democratic politics, so that they're willing to jail him and they're willing to label his organizations as extremist and then destroy them. So that's the way that we try and spin it, although it's very tricky to come up with a sort of silver lining for any of this. At the moment, things are very dark, and it's difficult to see that repression is going to reduce after the elections. If anything, it seems as though the authorities are doubling down. And part of that is because of the narrative that they constructed in the run-up to the elections. So they've equated any idea of criticism and opposition with treason. And you can't imagine that that narrative is easily shifted, but also those individuals within the elite who back a more coercive, repressive approach, it's unlikely that they're going to hang up their shoes and say, okay, we're done. They're going to double down, especially as we go forward. And the types of issues that have annoyed people, that have meant that they would support Navalny, aren't going to go away. So it's not as if by locking up Navalny, the Kremlin has solved corruption. It's not as if by destroying his movement, they've been able to bring rising food prices under control. And so without being able to deal with these more systemic issues, it's likely that repression is going to continue, and that his associates and his supporters who so far been able to evade law enforcement, it's likely they're going to have a very tricky time going forward.
It sounds like the citizen in perhaps particularly a country in this grey zone between democracy and full-scale authoritarianism faces a real dilemma. And do you stand up for what you believe in, potentially leading to all sorts of problems for yourself, but also for the broader cause that you're fighting for? Or do you collude, but therefore compromise on your most fundamental principles?
Definitely. And maybe just a small case study. Kat has already mentioned smart voting. And what that is doing, it's telling citizens, look, we're in an imperfect situation. We're in an electoral authoritarian regime. How do we deal with that system? Do we just turn away from politics completely? That's certainly one option. And it's one option that lots of opposition-minded voters took in the run-up to these latest elections. Or do you try and play the rigged system to your favor? And it led to these lists that Katya mentioned. It led to liberal voters being told to vote for Communist Party politicians because they were, in the estimations of Team Navalny, the best placed candidates to deny United Russia a seat in a particular constituency. And so that, I suppose, is a case study where people have to say, okay, my principles are one thing, but in order to deal with this system in which elections aren't free and fair, these are the choices that I have to make. Now, some people aren't willing to make those choices, but some people are willing in the short term to vote in a way that isn't consistent with their policy preferences or ideology, but with a view to focus on the short-term goal, which is to deny United Russia electoral victories in the hope that that might lead to some type of blow to the sitting political leadership.
Katerina?
Absolutely. I think Ben touches on what is very important in these electoral autocracies, and that has to do with two things, really. The direction of voter defections away from the ruling regime party, right? And here there is a twofold choice, right? You either defect and join the opposition of sorts, or you defect and disengage. And I think we've seen this for a while now, disengagement, especially amongst the liberals, the educated in Russia has been extensive in the last 3 years in ways that have also helped stabilize the regime. So the opposition, offering an alternative, even an imperfect one, through the smart voting system, I think is trying to capitalize on that discontent and persuade people to turn out and vote. Of course, I think Ben already mentions this, that the system was not without its criticisms, like lending support for right-wing candidates, left-wing candidates, the communists, etc. It did attract some disagreement, but I think it also points, in comparative perspective, it also points to the importance of, opposition coalitions in non-democratic regimes that we know are so hard to come by because of ideological differences around them.
We're more than out of time, but we always like in this podcast to look at the research process as well as the research outcomes. So just a couple of really quick questions, big questions, but quick questions if possible on that. Given all that we've been talking about here, is it possible to study Russian politics freely? Is it possible for you to go there, speak to whoever you want, ask whatever questions you want? Or are there constraints even on what you can do? Ben?
Just relating it to our research process, I've already mentioned that it's not as if we had to go out when writing the book to conduct new original research. We could draw on what we already had. So maybe I'm going to point to my contacts in journalism, those Russians who study Russian politics. And I got the sense, more than got the sense, I heard the same story repeated, that those sources that they have used for decades going back, this year, over the last 6 months, have started to shut up. And so even for those journalists speaking to insiders in ministries, within parliament, within parties in Russia, who've been willing to speak on background, they now think that the nature of the regime has changed such that by doing so would put them in danger. So I suppose that gives a sense of how much things have changed. And we're in a period of incredible uncertainty. It's not clear what is going to happen next year. I mentioned before that repression is likely to increase, but really, who knows? We're in a state of flux. It all depends on how the Kremlin responds to these elections and views things in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election. But I'd say studying Russia is trickier now than it has been for a very long time.
Katerina?
I agree with what Ben has said. I think changes in the political landscape influence how we do research. I would say, though, also that traditionally Russia has been a great place to study public opinion. The Russian election study, for example, the equivalent of the British election study, is the longest running election survey in a non-democracy. And we have waves in the field right now as well, before and after the election. I think there's consensus that people still are not concerned to freely and honestly express their views. And we see sharp criticism of the regime in opinion polls. And I think these are the kinds of concerns that have also motivated very interesting body of scholarship on how we can elicit truthful responses. How can we be sure and confident when studying public opinion in these regimes that people are expressing their true preferences? I think what has changed, and we see this increasingly, is that the regime is going against, organizations and independent media and organizations such as Over-the Info, whose primary task is to collecting information on protests and aid those demonstrating. So I think over time, our ability to document mobilization, especially subnationally, will be affected.
And final question to Ben. This is a remarkable book. I mean, I found it fascinating as a non-Russian politics expert, and it's very much intended for a general readership. You've been doing lots of publicity work for the book. It's been translated into I don't know how many different languages.
8.
8. Wow, very impressive. Would you recommend it to other scholars? It must have taken over your life over the last year. And I guess it's interesting that you're a young up and coming scholar. You've done this with a postdoc and a PhD student. There will be many other PhD students listening to this podcast. Do you recommend people doing this kind of work, or should we stick to the boring academic journal articles?
Yeah, it took over our lives for a certain number of months. And even during this publicity phase, it's quite demanding. The most demanding months were, as you can imagine, getting the first draft done and then the edits made to those drafts. But for those people thinking about that there's an opportunity to write a book that can explain something where they have research expertise to a non-specialist audience, I'd encourage them to do that. And I would say that the landscape in UK academia has shifted such that that can make sense in your career as well. So for those people thinking about it, I'd suggest write a one-page pitch and write the language. Make sure that it's as engaging as possible, but at the end of the day, you feel comfortable with it intellectually. You're not making completely overblown claims, but I'd suggest, nudging that boundary as far as you dare. Then I'd suggest reaching out to an agent. And some people can think you'd immediately approach a publisher, but an agent can be important in giving you a quick reaction as to whether they see any promise in this particular idea. And you can use their feedback to improve the pitch and then send to another agent or send to a publishing house. So I'd encourage anybody with an idea to develop it a bit, get some feedback and take it from there. But I think, approaching an agent first is useful. That's what we did, and it was absolutely invaluable.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ben Noble and Katerina Tertich-Naya. We've had a fascinating conversation there, ranging over a very broad spectrum, much of it pretty depressing, but perhaps there are some chinks of light there as well. And the book that we've been discussing is Navalny, Putin's Nemesis, Russia's Future, ? By Matti, Dollbaum, Morvan, Lallouet, and Ben Noble. And it's available in all good bookshops now. Next week, we'll be looking at the electoral impact of COVID-19. In particular, has the anxiety induced by the pandemic led voters to change the candidates they vote for? As ever, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.